Welcome to Beyond the Battlefield, a CIMVHR conversation on military, veteran, and family health. This series brings together researchers, organizational representatives, policymakers, healthcare providers, and people with lived experience to discuss a broad range of topics relative to military, veteran, and family health from a variety of perspectives. I am Nicholas Held, the Interim Scientific Director of CIMVHR, and today I am joined by a great group to speak to us about aging. To start, I'm going to turn to each of you to introduce yourselves to the listeners, including who you are and what perspective or perspectives you bring and are representing today. I'm going to turn it over to Nora and start with you, if that's okay, please.
Thanks, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Nora Spink. I'm the CEO of Work-Life Harmony Enterprises. I work on a number of projects related to military, veteran, family health. I'm currently working on several with the Garnet Families Network that's connected to CIMVHR. Been involved with CIMVHR for a very long time on a number of projects. Just finishing one study on solo retirees with the University of Ottawa and Waterloo, and just finished a report with the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence on military, veteran, family caregiving. And I currently am co-chair of the Minister of Veterans Affairs Family Advisory Group.
Great. Thanks so much, Nora. I'm very excited to have you here. Samir, I'll move on to you next.
Sure. So my name is Samir Sinha. I'm a geriatrician and a clinician scientist based at the University Health Network and Sinai Health in Toronto. But I'm also the Director of Health Policy Research at the National Institute on Aging. And so I treat and see older patients in my day-to-day practice, but I'm also very much interested in kind of the systems that we create and how we support the care and the needs of our aging population. And so I've had the privilege of caring for a number of older veterans, and I was always curious about the unique programs and services that we've created over time to better serve them. And so that led me to develop a report with the support of CIMVHR and the Canadian Frailty Network a few years ago through the NIA, where we actually looked at how do we better care for Canada's aging veterans. So I look forward to sharing a little bit of that as we chat today.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Samir. Ray, I'll have you next, please.
Yeah, hi. It's a real pleasure to be here. Honored to be invited. I was an infantry officer when I was younger. I graduated from the Combat Training Center in 1980 from the infantry school and served as an infantry platoon commander for a couple of years. I then pursued a career in medicine, became an emergency medicine specialist, got back into the forces in 2007 expressly to serve in Afghanistan. Served 2 tours there, setting the record for longest time in combat by a Canadian military doctor, because quite unusually for doctors, I was sent out to the forward operating bases where the fighting actually took place. I've come back from that. I wrote a couple of books about my experiences and have now come back to emergency medicine ever since 2019 when I fully retired from the armed forces. Such
a great career, Ray. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your service. Lee, I'll move on to you next, please.
Thanks. Hello, all. It's a real honor to be amongst this esteemed panel, so I appreciate the invite. My name is Lee Marshall. I'm the Senior Director of Healthcare Programs with Veterans Affairs Canada. Started my career with Veterans Affairs approximately 27 years ago as a social worker. And while I spent the majority of my career in frontline services with Veterans Affairs, I've also been in service policy and systems. Today, as a Senior Director for Healthcare Programs, I'm responsible and certainly can speak or bring the perspective of VAC's current programs, specifically the Treatment Benefits Program, our Long-Term Care Program, and our Veterans Independence Program, and perhaps maybe even talk a little bit about how these programs have evolved to meet needs over the number of years that they've been in place.
Sounds great. Thanks, Lee. As you can tell, we have an esteemed panel, as you said, and so many different perspectives that we can bring to this conversation. I'm looking forward to getting into it. And I think one of the key things here is when we say aging, it's a relatively broad topic, of course, and especially within the veteran community. So there's going to be opportunities to talk about many different aspects of it, which is very exciting. So I'm gonna start with the first question here, and then I'm going to direct it to Samir. But obviously, based on the experience around this screen, I'm happy for anyone to pick it up and move on from it and run with it as well. So when we're talking about aging veterans, who are we talking about? What does today's aging veteran actually look like? So Samir, I'll start with you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. When you think about aging veterans, I have to be honest that when I started this project to delve more deeply, I think, what comes to mind, I think for many people is you think about Remembrance Day ceremonies, you think about the World War II veterans that you see, and you imagine that those are aging veterans in particular. But really, the number of our what we call war service veterans, people who served, including up to World War II, there's only a few thousand of them left with us now. And people forget about how active Canada's armed forces have been from the Korean War onwards and so on. So we have about 500,000 veterans in Canada today, and 2/3 of them are actually 55 and older. So again, these aren't World War II, World War I veterans in particular. We're talking about people who served later on. And many of them are now aging. And so, of course, you could start saying, well, what do you define as aging? Traditionally, in society, we say 65 and older, and that's kind of an artificial construct that was created many years ago based on pensionable ages. But we know that some populations tend to experience aging syndromes, conditions, earlier, depending on their life experiences and other things. And we know certainly those who served our country, especially the changing nature of warfare, the changing nature of service, where our armed forces are no longer just doing things like being in an armed conflict, but attending to supporting people in forest fire situations, or even during the pandemic, supporting residents in our long-term care homes. The nature of military service has changed greatly. And what we're seeing is, a number of people who might be retiring earlier or experiencing higher levels than the normal civilian population of physical injuries or mental health issues, PTSD, these sorts of things. So the nature of how veterans are aging is certainly evolving and becoming more different and unique. And that's why I think it's really important that we think about our commitment to veterans as they age and as they want to increasingly age in their own homes. How do we actually look at the services that we create, the supports that we provide, and the care that aging veterans in particular will need? And so that's just a bit of an intro in terms of how I got introduced into this topic, but one where I think there's a lot of insightful things that I and my colleagues have learned along the way as well.
Yeah, I agree, Samir. And there's a lot of pieces there that you brought up that we could draw on. And the one you mentioned is kind of this 65 plus being a bit of a construct. And we know that veterans are often releasing from service younger, and some releasing well, some experiencing challenges. We have the data on that. What do we see in terms of aging veterans that makes their unique factors towards aging different from a civilian population? And I'm asking that question to anybody who wants to jump in.
Well, I can certainly start. I think, again, as I mentioned, if people have experienced, more physical injuries, for example, then we know more musculoskeletal injuries and other factors like that, or there's a higher prevalence of that we see amongst veterans in general and our veterans in particular. And this is data that's actually, there's a survey that's done on a regular basis that helps capture, what are the experiences of veterans. And so we also see higher rates of mental health issues, maybe depression, anxiety, but also higher rates of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. So again, it's just these ideas that there's some of these things that are just more uniquely prevalent amongst older veterans. And I think it's important to recognize that, because there are two things that we talk about in our report. What are the things that we can do so that when Ray was serving, are there things that we could do to help, prevent, musculoskeletal injuries, be more proactive about mental health supports and other things, so that we can maybe prevent the growing prevalence of that. And then as people are aging, for example, it's understanding that the nature at which they age or experiences of the types of care they might receive, for example, in a long-term care setting, should take into account that, oh goodness, they were a veteran, right? So how do I now start thinking about what they may have experienced in their lives, what they may have seen in terms of combat or other situations that may manifest itself if a person's developing dementia or other issues, where some of these issues can resurface in different ways as well. So I think this is where some of these kind of health aspects in particular have come to bear.
Can I just jump in there just for a quick second? In terms of operational stress injuries and PTSD, I just want to express a moment of pride for my Army because the Canadian Forces has done a phenomenal job with this. We hear about the suicides and we hear about the times things go off the rails, but the reality is that we actually send psychologists, social workers into the combat area, like not directly into combat, but they'll go to the forward operating bases and they'll talk to guys who've just had a really difficult mission. You know, they've lost a friend, they've maybe been shaken up by an improvised explosive device themselves, and they've had a close call. So that treatment starts right in the combat area, and then beyond that, we track people fairly closely. Everybody gets a post-deployment survey to detect if there's any operational stress injury features to their lives right now, and then we try to address that. And so because of that, you know, the number of people who come back with untreatable OSI, you know, after the tours in Afghanistan was down to 2%. You know, it's not zero, and these people are going to suffer long term. But you know, NATO recognized this. We got an award from NATO during the war about how well we were treating operational stress injuries, and so I just, you know, we're aware of this, and I just think that Canada needs to know that behind the headlines of veteran suicides, there's some pretty good news there and some pretty good work being done.
Yeah, and I would add to that, sorry, Lee, I would add to that some of the prevention work that's being done right in early stages of people's careers. Programs like Road to Mental Readiness, where people are given language and tools and resources. So when they get into the battlefield and the social worker comes to check on them, they have the language, the confidence to be able to reach out and either seek assistance or receive it when it's offered.
Yeah, I think that's the piece I wanted to just weigh in on. I think we're much more comfortable as a society talking about these issues. And, you know, one of my first experiences 27 years ago was an interaction with a World War II veteran and his spouse. And it was only at that point in time that he had recognized post-traumatic stress disorder and had sought out counseling. And of course, I assisted the family with that process. And his wife said to me, for the first time since he left for the war, I have my husband back, the man who left to go to war. And that was super impactful for me, but it occurred to me that he had spent the better part of his life not talking about it and not addressing or not seeking out support. So I think we do a much better job as a society at addressing that now and being comfortable talking about it. But I also wanted to make another point. One of the other challenges, I think, with this current group is if you look at the way the department evolved, Veterans Affairs evolved over the last century. Really, we started with hospitals to treat acute care post-war, and then we moved those hospitals into long-term care facilities. And then in the 80s, we said, oh, we need to help people become independent in their own homes. So we created the Veterans Independence Program. But there was always this large cohort of veterans that had similar needs, and we followed them through their lives. The current group of veterans, while there are many of them that are over 55, to Samir's point, we have a range of needs. We have young veterans who are looking for employment. We still have acute veterans, but then we also have veterans who are aging, who perhaps were injured 25, 30 years ago. So it's a very interesting time. And that presents a challenge, but it also presents an opportunity because we're engaging veterans at different points in their lives, and we have an opportunity to do things like health promotion or to engage them about how can we address either pre-injury or post-injury so that it doesn't become a chronic problem later on in life.
I think your point, Lee, about this being considered in context, we have, as a society, become way more comfortable talking about mental health and well-being. We're also seeing that in the aging space. So even the language around aging, we're seeing shifting to well-being. We're hearing more about longevity and vitality and thriving, and reframing the idea of moving through our lives. Those of us who are lucky enough to see 60, 70, 80, 90 plus, that it's not just about what we're losing, but it's also about what we can offer communities and what we can experience in terms of joy and happiness, and not just illness and disability. And I think that shift is happening in the community for sure, and I think beginning to happen in all of the community spaces that people go to for help, assistance, guidance, support, and their families.
I want to build on that too, Nora, because I think, just as what Ray was saying about, like, let me tell you what it was like, right? That actually there is proactive things happening, because that's something we focused on our report, saying we should ensure this is happening. And more importantly, I'm glad to hear that someone who served said, I've seen this, it's actually happening, and we're being definitely more proactive. Because I think, Lee, in your example, that may not have been there, for that earlier World War II veteran, right? So it's amazing to see how the forces have evolved. One of the most interesting things, one of the reasons I agreed to do this report, and wanted to work with VAC on this in particular, was they said, look, as a geriatrician, it's really hard for me to find the right mix of services for my older patients, scrounging for home care, getting the right supports. And so I learned very early on as a medical student that I always ask someone if they've served, not just so I can thank them for their service, but most importantly, I have more options to better support older patients if they have served, for example. And so it's one thing I always teach my trainees, it's like ask, because there's this magical thing called the Veterans Independence Program that's only available for veterans, not for regular civilians. And it actually fills in key gaps that can really make the difference between, whether someone can stay independent in the community or not. There's also an enhanced beyond standard caregiver benefits. And I think Nora can speak more to this as well. They have a unique caregiver recognition benefit, for example, and how valuable this has actually been. And so, the fact that these programs have been established, and not just as of late, for example, as aging is becoming less, as Nora was just saying, less deficit oriented, more asset oriented as well. It's been cool to see how Canada has been a leader in some of these programs. And let's be clear here. Part of it isn't just, it's all about love and better supporting. It's also fiscal. I mean, this just makes better sense. If you had to care for someone in a care home, it's much more expensive than helping them stay in their own home and being independent. So there was awareness and there was acknowledgement. And this is a wonderful policy area where we're like, wait a minute, what our veterans want is actually cheaper for all of us as a society. So this is actually, it's better value for everybody in that way. And what was neat was when we looked at some of the other countries like Australia, New Zealand, the UK, in particular, we saw that they've actually adopted these programs, and they've almost like stolen the names too. Which, I always say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but it was great to see, back to Ray's point, NATO recognizing how progressive, the armed forces have been, but also interesting to see how some of the great ideas like the VIP program established decades ago is something that now exists in another format in Australia and New Zealand as well, for example.
And part of that is the recognition that the people who have these experiences and people in their close circle of support, their loved ones, are informing these policies. So the caregiver recognition benefit actually came from the family advisory group. So there are things that we are learning by engaging with people who have the lived experience and who are living every single day asking these kinds of questions. And I'm sure, Ray, you see this in your work all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. It's interesting as you've described the evolution of especially our perception of it. I mean, if you compare what things were like in 1979 at the Combat Training Center to, 2009 as my second tour was ending, it's night and day, the difference in how we evolved through that.
I guess maybe Rick, can I ask you this question, right? So, technically you're an aging veteran, but you're still very much working and having, and quite active and engaged. As you think now as a veteran and your future aging journey, for example, and I always tell people, you could live longer than you think, right? We know that life expectancy now on average in Canada is 82 years of age. We have more people making it to 100 than ever before, and we know when we ask Canadians kind of where do you want to age, literally almost everybody says I want to stay in my own home for as long as possible, and I don't know if you've given further thought to what will my future aging journey look like, and how might I engage with some of these services Veterans Affairs has, or I wish Veterans Affairs had this as well, because I think this could also be important. I don't know if you've given any thought to this, or just in terms of how you're thinking about your future.
Well, I suppose in typical soldier fashion, right? I'm pretty independent in that way. I've thought, I mean, I recently bought this house that I'm in right now. And although I'm going to do a half Ironman at the end of the summer, I made sure that the house is one where I drive up and my bedroom, living room, dining room, kitchen, everything's on one floor. I hope not to be at the point where that becomes a real issue for another decade or more, but I'm already thinking ahead that way because very much I want to stay here. I want to stay in my home as long as possible. I want to be independent as long as possible. I think, like a lot of soldiers, we our physical persona is a big part of who we are, and we want to hang on to that as long as possible. So, yeah, I'm thinking about it definitely, but with my own resources. I'm not. I haven't yet thought about how I would have interact with Veterans Affairs Canada. Now, having said that, quite obviously, as somebody who's been working in medicine for 30 years, I have resources that a lot of veterans will not have, and I have options because of that open up a lot of possibilities for me where I will not need anybody else's help. I just need to make sure that I plan my own life and budget my nest egg appropriately. But that's I have options there that a lot of veterans don't.
Can I ask a question? And I'm not sure. I'm not sure who should answer this one, but I agree with the concept. Most of us want to stay in our own homes for as long as we can. And Samir, you talked about how cost-effective the Veterans Independence Program is, and we've seen that over the years. It is quite less expensive than long-term care. However, I also can't help but recognize that loneliness and isolation and social interaction are also key for any type of satisfaction or well-being later on in life. So I wonder, from a policy point of view or from a program development point of view, where do we go with addressing those types of concerns like isolation and loneliness, recognizing that most folks want to remain in their own home and often alone as a result of consequences of life, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and so through the National Institute on Aging, we do an annual Aging in Canada survey, and so this is where we survey people 50 and older, and when we looked at what people reported as their risk, what we perceive as their risk of experiencing social isolation, it's about 43% this year. And amongst the same cohort, when we asked about, any experiencing of loneliness, for example, we saw it was as high as 58%. So it gives you a sense that these are issues there. And I think it's always important to remember that these aren't one and the same things. If you're isolated, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be lonely. Some people are perfectly fine on their own, but obviously people who are more isolated, as we're naturally social beings, are at greater risk of experiencing loneliness. And there are people who could be living with a number of other people and could feel terribly isolated and lonely in those settings. So it's not one and the same, but certainly it's one of these things as we think about that as we age and we're likely to experience some of these symptoms. And the thing is, why are we even talking about this? Well, we know that severe loneliness has been seen as the equivalent of smoking upwards of 15 cigarettes a day. So it's something that we have to take seriously, and something that we have to kind of better address. So I see it in two ways. One is, if we're thinking about people who are in the community, who might be aging on their own, for example, or just maybe become more isolated because of mobility or other concerns, how are we leveraging things like the VIP program or through the caregiver recognition benefit and those supports so that we can help people stay engaged, and as members of their community, maybe as members of the local legion, maybe with support to get to and from and those sorts of things, whatever those barriers might be, or more online things that allow people to stay connected in various ways. And then, because, my solution isn't, if you're lonely, move into a care home. Many people can't afford a private care home, number one. And again, when we're thinking about even care residences, people can be very isolated and lonely in those settings too. So it's making sure that, again, we do have services and support so that as we're becoming much more comfortable talking about how we feel and what we might be experiencing, is that someone like Ray, for example, who served as an older veteran, if he's experiencing this, he's like, I have words to describe this. I know what this is. And apparently VAC may have some things that might help me, deal with this better. And so it's just making sure that we're keeping an eye on these trends and then seeing, what is the role that VAC can play. It's not that VAC has to do everything, but often there are other resources and supports in our local communities that sometimes people can plug into. So it's just thinking about this is a growing issue, and one that we have to be mindful, especially as we age. We're more likely to outlive family members and friends. We have a high rate of about 23% of older Canadians, or about 1/3 of older Canadians are living on their own. And about 1/4 of older Canadians report they don't have a family member or friend close at hand who could help them with a basic task like getting a prescription filled. So it just shows you how, again, living on your own does not mean loneliness, but it just puts people at increased risk of social isolation and potentially loneliness. And so how do we keep an eye on that? And how do we make sure that we support that as we can?
Yeah, and I'd like to pick up on 2 points. One, when a U.S. Surgeon General described loneliness as the equivalent of 15 cigarettes, not a lot of people could relate to that. He's now talking about it's the equivalent of consuming 6 alcoholic beverages per day. Mm. Imagine what that does to your body, your ability to connect, to organize, to manage your day-to-day. The other piece is loneliness. When we started the project on solo retirees in Canada, we looked at all of the studies that were out there that currently existed around loneliness. And we found them for linguistic minorities and sought for 2S LGBTQ+. We also sought for Indigenous seniors, for new immigrants and refugees, divorced, widowed people, women. We didn't find any that included veterans in any way, except the work that CIMVHR had been doing on specifically around loneliness. The second thing I wanted to just touch on is this whole idea of connection, because what we've learned a lot from both military families, veterans, and veteran families is that it's not just about the kind of social connections that we think about for somebody like me. Because of the nature of the work and what draws people into military service, changing their identity when they go from active service to veteran is one major transition. Another is when they go from being the provider, the protector, the people who are giving to the country, to then at some point, either slowly or suddenly, needing to ask for and accept help and support. It's another big transition. And that's often challenging when you don't have a really strong circle of support around you. And we know that increasingly, particularly for women vets, their circle of support is quite small and tends to be made up of mostly other women vets. And what the research is showing with loneliness, it's not just about being around people, as Samir mentioned, but it's having confidants, people that you can share your biggest secret stories and fears with. But it's also the cheerleaders, somebody who's advocating on your behalf, conveners and organizers and companions and caregivers. And also what we're seeing is a lot of veterans are also providing care, and they're taking on the role of caregiver to either other vets or other family members, because that's what they do. They take care of things and people and keep us safe and keep us well. And so I think we need to really think carefully about how we're sort of transferring what those of us who haven't served experience with aging and care and caregiving, and those that do. I don't think it's a direct link between one world and the other. And we certainly need way more research in this space for sure.
I have one question to jump in here. This is a fascinating conversation. And my question is based around, if we're linking, associating the impacts on health of loneliness related to smoking or alcohol intake, right? Just in terms of the impacts on health. You stop smoking, you see improvements, and there's factors around how to support people to stop smoking. And same with drinking, right? And those can be relatively quick changes to your health, which is great. How do you make somebody feel less lonely? It's not like you can add people to it, right? It's not like, if you're a researcher, you're a program manager, you're a clinician, what does that actually look like to develop somebody who's feeling less lonely to get those health benefits? And I know this is a bit of there's probably not any defined answer here, but it's an interesting concept to me around, it's not just adding the number of people there. And we can add programs where I can help the aging veteran have somebody who comes to their home and runs their daily prescriptions or whatever it might be, but that's still not creating that social connection that so many of us might need.
Yeah, so I think, again, this is such a personal issue, but it's such a prevalent issue. And Nora just kind of outlined some of the life changes that can occur, right? So when we think about older people in particular, people who retire from work, not necessarily retiring from service, because that might have happened much earlier on in their lives, but a retirement, a major change in one's role in society where you don't have that regular network of people that you might have, worked with and considered friends, divorce, for example, losing a spouse or a partner, all these sorts of things are just things that are more likely to happen. And one thing that I see in some of my patients is they're like, look, I'm 95 and I've outlived most of my family members and friends. It's quite isolating now, right? It's just kind of me left. And so it's understanding what is driving that nature of being isolated or lonely. And sometimes it's just a matter of connecting someone with the transportation mechanism so they can get out and about in the community and continue to stay connected as they like to do that. As I mentioned, for example, maybe someone, wants to get out to the local Legion and says, I can't afford, I can't drive myself and someone can't drive me, but if there's a service that can take me to and from, that would be amazing. So it's kind of figuring out what is the barrier there. And sometimes it's just people like, I don't know anybody anymore. I'm on my own, right? And it's like, so what do you like to do, right? Maybe there's a club, maybe there's, so we, in Ontario, for example, we've continued to expand the number of what we call seniors active living centers, where people can gather with other older people and do things of interest together and build networks and build those friendships as well. And so I think we're talking about it more, and we're allowing people to kind of get opportunities. There's something called social prescribing, which is gaining some traction now, where through a healthcare practice, they might prescribe you some options or things that can get you connected and linked up with more social things of interest for you in the community, and that way you can start rebuilding those networks and developing new networks as well that can keep you engaged and at your level of interest. So I think this is kind of, again, it's just the key is that we're even talking about it. And back to what Ray was saying, my gosh, you go back 20, 30 years ago, no one was talking about this. We're now talking about it a lot more. And I think to Nora's point, we have to think about, is there a particular angle that's unique to the aging veteran, for example? And as Nora was saying, she's looked at a lot of the literature and the research, and there's not a lot that specifically focuses on the aging veteran, but other populations. There must be some other unique things we should be aware of, so that VAC, for example, as it's creating its new services or other supports, for example, might have some insights that can better support its programming as well.
I just think you guys have put your finger on a really important issue, because you think of what we're like, those of us who are drawn to military service, we tend to be team players, right? We tend to be people who not just we actually gravitate towards doing things as a group, doing things as a unit. And when we lose that, boy, it's a big part of our identity that goes out the window. And even myself, right? I turn 67 next week. And I'd like to work for maybe another 3 years, but I'm already thinking, what's it going to be like when I don't have, 20 emerge shifts a month, and I don't have all these other things that sort of connect me to teams, specifically teams engaged in some kind of not just remunerative, but it's a mission, a mission in life, something that I see as having a positive impact on the community or on my country. A lot of us are going to feel like that, and I'm already starting to think, like, what's that going to be like when I'm 5 years out of practice, and and nobody remembers, who I am, what I've done, and who am I going to be associating with at that point. So you guys have put your finger on something really important, but probably even more so for the veteran, just because of our association with teams and our desire to be part of a unit. It's part of
And I think an interesting thing you just said there, Ray, too, as you were describing that, there's definitely some personal reflection on yourself. Like, what's my day gonna look like? What's my week gonna look like? But you also said a key part to there of military service is when I'm not giving back to my community necessarily, right? And then that's something you mentioned, a team player, but the other aspect is your sense of pride and service to the country or to the to Canadians in the emergency room. There's always this kind of giving back. And I think that was interesting in your description too. It's not only about my personal venture for me, but it's just my sense of who I am and my identity to give back to a community.
That's what warriors are, right? I mean, we are by definition people who are protectors. We want to feel like we're doing something for the greater good of our community, of our country. So to lose that and to be on the receiving end, of help it's a bit of a shift.
It's also one of the motivators that True Patriot Love used to launch their veteran volunteer program that's just come up. But I think what strikes me, Samir, from what you were saying, is that if you can't afford transportation to get to these programs, they're not going to be useful for you. this takes me to the I solution versus the system solutions. I can find somebody to drive me there, but we need to look at bigger system solutions as well. In Quebec, in the city of Montreal, once you turn 65, you get access to free public transit. And people can get from point A to point B, from program to program, from friend to friend, coffee to coffee. From a public policy perspective, I'm sure Lee and his buddies are looking at, how you support people to stay at home. Transportation is way less expensive. A taxi ride or two a week is way less expensive than a typical long-term care option, which starts now at $5,000 a month. And if you need specialty care like dementia, you're looking at $10,000 a month. You need a pretty big nest egg. Is that what you called it, Ray? You're preparing for future. A lot of people don't have that luxury. And so when we look at solutions, I think we have to look at both what individuals can do and their families and circles of support, but also what systems can do and offer both the veteran and those that love care and support them.
And this builds on this idea, like, we talked about this in our report, is like, what do we do for people in service? And Ray spoke to that, kind of the services that he saw on his second major tour that was like, okay, wow, these were not here when I started. I'm glad they're here now because they're better supporting people. And then we talk about what is that kind of aging well strategy for veterans as well, right? So, and this is kind of, Ray, what you shared with us is that, gosh, I'm going to be retiring from my role doing 20 shifts a week, for example, and then what's next, right? And that's the key thing is like, are we making sure that people are being supported to have these conversations, think about these things, and then giving them some tools so that people might think, okay, well, we are by nature team players. We like to give, we like to support, that. And so Nora, you might be able to speak to this too, because I was just writing a report that will launch in June looking at our community-based senior services sectors, so thousands of organizations across the country that really rely on dedicated volunteers, whether it's a Meals on Wheels program or other transportation program, whatever that is, where there's often lots of volunteers. And it was interesting because part of it was looking at volunteerism in Canada, and they were saying that kind of volunteerism amongst older people's been on the decline, and not necessarily because older people don't want to volunteer, but there was a fun stat in there that showed many people are just not being asked. Right. And that if you actually, if I said to Ray, my gosh, Ray, Ironman, you've got some free time coming up. Would you be willing to support, say, this service or that service? Could you donate some time? Could you do that? And it was just interesting about not seeing older people in general, forget older veterans, but older people in general in Canada as a resource that, Ray, you mentioned, what's my purpose? What's going to be next? What do I have on my T-shirt? Is what am I doing? Kind of in my 70s, in my 80s, in that way. And that will always change. But when we don't ask people, we don't invite them to tell us what they could do, what they would want to do, and how they can continue to contribute in a way that's meaningful for them personally, but also can be vastly helpful for our communities as well. So it was just interesting because I was just thinking about all that as it was popping up. And I don't know, Nora, if you have any other, because I know you've done a lot of work around caregiving, volunteerism, and that, but it was one of these aha moments that I had recently where I thought, gosh, we don't even ask older people if they can contribute. And if you do, they're often like, sure, but just nobody ever asked me.
But I also think this has to do with the framing, because if we can stop thinking about and talking about and describing aging as decay, decline, negative, needy, dependent, and talk about resource, asset, well-being, vitality. Even if I don't have all my limbs, I can still be vital and focus on longevity and engage in whatever interests I have if we create the environment where they're welcome, respected, included. One of the most interesting things that I think I've read lately is the piece about the convener. Oftentimes it's the person that asks, that invites others in, that both address the loneliness and isolation, but also connect back to community. And I think if we start thinking about aging as a gift, as an opportunity, as something we should be looking forward to, because most people don't. And Ray, I think you're an exception in terms of how proactive you've already made your move to your perhaps forever home. Not everybody does that. I mean, you just look at the stats around how many people don't have even a will or a power of attorney for personal care. Like, if they're not doing that, they're definitely not thinking about accessibility in their next home or what's going to happen when they can't drive anymore, especially since so many veterans, when they retire, even when they leave service, move to communities in rural, remote parts of the country. They're not jumping into downtowns in a big way. And we need to factor that in. I see Lee nodding. This is something that's very unique to this population.
Yeah, I actually wanted to build on that some time ago, because you had talked about it requires systems. We have social transportation, as an example, as part of the Veterans Independence Program. But what's vital is that there has to be somewhere to go. There has to be someone engaging them. And for our veterans that work that live in urban centers, there's a lot more programming, there's a lot more opportunity, but those don't necessarily exist in rural or even suburban Canada, right? And these are the challenges we see. So the solution we can enable as a federal department, provincial entities can enable and create. But there has to be a grassroots movement. There has to be, to the point you made, individuals have to ask these seniors to come out. They have to invite them to be a part of whatever's happening in the community. And that's key, because without somewhere to go, without someone to give them that sense of purpose, having a social transportation is kind of futile if they have nowhere to take them, right? So I wonder, from a grassroots perspective, how do we as Canadians, because I read something there the other day that said Americans have a much higher volunteerism rate than Canadians. And I was kind of shocked at that, because we pride ourselves on being so caring and giving. But perhaps that's the issue. We're not asking, and we're not creating the environment to do that.
Yeah, there was also some interesting work done on both volunteering, but also corporate philanthropy in the two countries. And one of the reasons why we're not doing it in this country as much as there is, in the US, they assume government's going to provide nothing. So everybody's sort of doing it. Whereas here it's the opposite. Oh, well, government takes care of that. Government's going to provide what I need. And so they're less inclined to jump in and do it themselves. But I also think, picking up on what Ray was saying, this is a community that are service oriented, are country oriented. I work with a lot of different groups, and there aren't very many that talk about purpose to country or service to country. It's neighborhood, it's community, it's particular area of interest. I think there's something very unique about those people who have military service or are loving somebody who's had military service. Your perspective is so different. And if we can harness some of that and use that as a community resource, then I think a lot of these situations and circumstances people find themselves in can be solved and resolved by engaging these people who have been doing this as part of their career, as part of their lives, as part of being in service to the country.
And it's interesting because a few things that kind of help tie this together. I always remind people that life expectancy in 1900 in Canada was 51 years of age. When we created Medicare back in 1965, our life expectancy was in our high 60s, and the average Canadian was 27 years of age. And so, I could say to Ray, okay, well, as an average Canadian, your life expectancy is 82. So when you retire, you have at least 12 years of longevity dividend you wouldn't have had. But I suspect Ray's going to go much beyond 82 and be doing lots of fun and exciting things. And so, A, there's that. B, I think what's always interesting, and I think this is the interesting vantage point where you have, our Canadian Armed Forces, you have Veterans Affairs Canada, and then the VIP program, and these other supports and services that exist within 13 provincial and territorial health and social services systems. I'm sure it does Lee's head in every once in a while with saying how, some provinces actually fund community transportation services and even have a focus on rural and remote communities. Others don't, right? It's a real patchwork as we look at kind of, the types of long-term care services, home and community care services, and community support services. It's a complete. There's huge variations, and I have to say one thing. I was, in the United States, where there's just different cultural norms and levels based on, what Nora was mentioning. But they actually had something called the Older American Act, passed in 1965, that actually has federal funding that then creates a network of 13,000 senior centers, funds transportation, like just actually has like a base, of these services and volunteer opportunities. And that might be what drives kind of volunteerism, whereas for so much of it, it's like a patchwork quilt. That's why, as a frontline clinician, I'm kind of like, know the neighborhood. I always actually look, whenever I have an older person, I always look at their address and their postal code. I'm sure Ray might do this too, because then you start, or even look at the address and you're like, okay, I know what that building is. I know what services are available, because, too many Canadians, no matter what you've done, are living in a postcode lottery of care and support. And so I think that's why, we have to think about the aging veteran in that context. But then, as Nora was just saying, there's a very unique quality to those who have served, and how that might change their perspectives on how they want to age and what's important to them. And then how we need to better respond as a country, to support these folks to age as well as possible. So it's just such an interesting, it's such an interesting kind of vantage point to think about.
And just to close off, I'll make this my last comment. I think one of the differences too, between Canada and US, and where we're lacking, I think, in some of the community-based services and supports, is in the US, you're only 1, maybe 2 degrees removed from somebody who's veteran connected.
Yeah.
In Canada, there are people who have never met anybody who has ever served. And, maybe pockets in Atlantic Canada, or parts of, Quebec near Valcartier, or parts of Alberta, BC. But a big part of this country has never been to a military anything. I think that makes a big difference when it comes to community-based services, and why we're not seeing the kind of research on or intentional inclusion of veterans in some of the community-based programs and services. And they may not feel welcome. They may not feel included because they don't see themselves in it. We've heard lots of stories about people in long-term care, particularly women, who come Remembrance Day don't even get the courtesy of being included in Remembrance Day services within the long-term care. So we've got a long way to go to build awareness and to build understanding and to create these opportunities for inclusion, while we're working with the individual veterans and their families and services and support. We've got to bring all these together in order to focus on vitality and longevity and making sure that veterans and their families live long and well and feel the appreciation and the respect that this country has for them in their day-to-day activities as they age.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I can remember before my second tour in Afghanistan, a fellow physician living in Toronto, access to all the communication media you can imagine, said, "Oh, you're going back to Afghanistan," and she said, "So are we peacekeepers there?" And we'd lost over 120 soldiers killed in action at that point. And I said, "No, we're actually fighting a war, and we've been fighting one for about 5 years now." And, um, a lot of people when I came back from Afghanistan would say, "Oh, I heard you were in Iraq." That's actually two countries over, and we're not there at all. It was interesting to see the degree to which people disconnected, and yet they'd be very supportive of us. They sort of had a vague sense that there was something going on, that Canadians were fighting, and so there was a lot of respect, but there wasn't a lot of understanding of what we were doing, where we were. I did a lot of public speaking around the publication of my books, and the most common response I got from people was, "I had no idea."
Mhm.
Yeah, it was interesting. There's
We,
quite a disconnection there.
sorry, Ray, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I was just going to say two things. We started off talking about purpose, loneliness, social isolation, and engaging veterans to become more involved in the community is the right thing to do. But one of the things we didn't really talk about is the impact on the cost of care. When veterans are able to remain in their own homes, that means for those who do need a long-term bed, there's a bed available. And for the caregivers who are at home with the veteran, who are spending all their time and energy supporting the veteran, potentially, if that veteran is now part of the community and engaged in the community, there's a respite impact there. So there's a lot of peripheral reasons for us to do this type of work to further engage this group, because it benefits all of us in the end, not just the fact that at the end of the day we'll have more volunteers supporting our country as well, right? So it's a really good point. And then the second point I was going to make is in the US, they were doing something called a community covenant, which was a way of engaging a community around the value that we have veterans in our community and this is who they are, and just a community appreciation. We actually did one in my home community. It was fortunate because the mayor happened to be a veteran himself, and the community is a fairly higher population of veterans. And what a difference it made. That unfortunately it doesn't last because we don't have the community continuing to support it. But what a difference it made just when we made the announcement, the number of veterans who came out and felt acknowledged, okay, my hometown recognizes who we are. We can learn a lot from some of these other countries in terms of how they do it. And, it's something that we should continue to pursue, I guess.
I think we're getting close to time, and this is a great way to wrap up, is this understanding of this theme that we've had of knowing there's unique factors of service that can be such a contribution later in life and back to the civilian community, and that people want to contribute in this way. And then there's other pieces and this is within healthcare, educating our healthcare providers, educating our program owners and operators and designers, pieces around challenges that could be faced as well. And not only health, but if you look at the identity of those who tend to join service and last in service, it is that giving back to the community, that service element. And Ray, you had something earlier, which was a small point in your sentence, but it was significant too. It was talking about we are planning and moving from serving others to accepting service yourself, right? And that's a piece that might not come easily to a lot of veterans. But and Nora, when we talked earlier, you mentioned independence to interdependence to dependence. And I think that interdependence there, that ability to feel like part of my identity is I'm still able to accept these supports, and in a system way give back to Canada still. And it's not waiting until the point where that identity is lost again, but building in that acceptance, which I'm imagining is challenging for a lot of veterans and the makeup of who they are. It's not about me, it's about the mission, and it's about everybody else. And as soon as now it becomes about me and the needs that I have, that's probably another challenging thing to face that we can support on as well. So in that way, I hope this conversation can be a small piece of mobilizing this around to people within our network, within your networks. Hopefully we reach more people than we expect to hear this conversation, how important it is from a community level. It's not just research, it's not just clinicians, but we all really have a role to play to understand and support those who've served our country and design programs that not only welcome them, but in an ideal world are designed for them in aspects as well. So this has been a great conversation, and I thank all of you for being here. Each of you offered such important information to the listeners. I know this is going to be a popular one, but as I said, we are unfortunately out of time. So if there's any last messages that people want to close on, I open the floor, and you're welcome to share those.
Okay. Just remember the ones we lost.
Thanks, Ray. I think that's a great ending point there. Thanks, everybody, for your time and joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.